Hello, my HS358D students. This is Professor Donald Earl Collins. It is the start of week 5. We are now in the second quarter to third-ish of the course. Thank you for bearing with me these last few weeks, particularly the last couple of weeks, going over slavery and in all the major dimensions of the hell that slavery was, chattel slavery was for African peoples living in what would become the United States of America, living in colonial America in this period. Um, I need not tell you how horrific those last couple weeks are. Whenever I teach this course, that particular part is always hard on me. I don't know how hard it is on you. I imagine it has to be pretty hard on all of you to hear how horrific slavery was, to see in some respects through film and other means how horrific slavery was, right? And yet, out of slavery comes the origins of African American, and really to a large extent, even American culture, because American culture is born out of all of this hell. It is, right? Because of the issue of crossover. Crossover in terms of culture, like a crossover dribble, means that you're moving from one direction to the next. And when you move in certain directions, it has an impact on more than just you. It has an impact on people who are trying to resist you or conversely trying to own you, right? So there's that. One of the greatest myths when it comes to um, culture in general, American history in general, African American history in general, is the idea that enslaved Africans were completely and utterly stripped of their culture. It is a gigantic myth. There are some folks among African American scholars in the social sciences, particularly conservative scholars like the late Thomas Sowell, among others. There are others who've argued on both sides of this, like the late Stanley Crouch, and a host of others who've made the argument that African Americans have no culture. There are certainly Afrocentrists who have made some sense of that argument too, and therefore we meaning African Americans, construct the culture essentially out of nothing. That's all BS, and I say that for a reason. Um, First of all, I mean, I don't care how many kidnapped folks from um, continent of Africa ended up coming to the U.S. I don't care, if it took them 6 months or even 8 months to get to the U.S. They still possess some language. They still possess some religion. They still possess some sense of music, some sense of dance, some sense of how to grow things, of how to do things, of how to be a certain way, based on where they grew up, based on what they were exposed to. If the average age of someone coming over from the continent's roughly 20 years old, that's almost 2 decades of enculturation. You're not going to strip that after 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, etc. That takes time to shatter, to break apart. So these people are going to be broken, right? They're going to be broken people. They're going to be experiencing some sort of PTSD. But just because they're experiencing that in the horrific dehumanization process of slavery doesn't mean you've literally beat and shattered all of African culture and cultures out of these folks, right? They might have practiced what they practiced in secret, but that doesn't mean that they were completely and utterly stripped of culture. They took the shards of what remained from their brokenness, from the PTSD, from the dehumanization process that was slavery, and they started to build a culture that was unique from where they came from, but also not akin to everything that they were learning on this side of the Atlantic either. So it's a complete fallacy to argue that these folks were completely stripped of culture. You strip a people of a culture, what are they? They're completely blank slates. And if they're completely blank slates, how are they constructing anything, right? It's a bothersome argument. It's basically, as far as I'm concerned, it's a stupid argument. I've always thought that argument was stupid, even before I became a historian, even before I went to graduate school, even before I started college. I thought that was a stupid argument, that to argue that African Americans were a people without culture, or African Americans and their ancestors were completely stripped of culture. You might have been Parts of it might have been shattered. Certainly, the links to um, cultures in Senegal, Gambia, or in Dahomey, or in Songhai, or in Congo, and other places all over that's now Africa south of the Sahara. Um, there's a difference between having to build something completely out of nothing and having pieces that you have to stitch back together again. And when you in the process of stitching it back together again, they become a little different. So I want to make sure that that is clear. And so this week really revolves around understanding the ways in which enslaved Africans, enslaved black folk began to piece together what we would now consider African American culture, right? It wasn't based on nothing, right? Dance, religion, music, food is all based on something that folks were able to bring over with them that survived the Middle Passage, that survived the kidnapping, that survived the initial brutality of slavery, that survived to make it to their kids who were born in this country and their grandkids and their great grandkids and their other descendants. So that, yes, it wasn't going to be exactly the same, but it doesn't have to be exactly the same for it to be at least part African, right? And so, everything that I'll discuss in class this week in terms of dance, ring shout, the purpose of the ring shout, the adaptation of Christianity to the needs of enslaved Africans, right? To where some sort of syncretism takes place, where there's some synthesis between some African practices, like veneration of ancestors, still seeps through even among folks who are otherwise essentially adopting some form of Protestant Christianity, right? It's not until the mid 18th century that you start seeing a more hardcore version of Christianity that doesn't necessarily allow for it. But even then, by then it's too late. There's still some veneration taking place. Honor your elders and all that. All that's in the stories that these folks tell through music, through dance and song, through preaching and so on and so forth, right? So there's that. There's food, right? If you're cooking for yourself, and if you happen to have been, of a Muslim background, at some point, either you're going to eat pork fat or you're going to die, right? So, maybe a lot of people over over 2 or 3 generations gradually figure out ways to hammer out a food culture when you're basically eating scraps. You're not eating the best of a cow. You're not eating the best of a pig. You're not eating the best of chicken if you are enslaved. And so you have to figure out, well, how do I make this work for me? And so the development of what we now consider black cuisine, African American food, and food traditions comes out of the mixture of what knowledge these folks came over with in terms of spices and roots and leaves and vegetables and fruits, and adapting that to a diet that's not consistent with what they grew up around, right? Over 1 generation, 2 generations, 3 generations, 4 generations, to figure out ways of making collard greens and mustard greens and turnips into not just edible food, but enjoyable edible food and food that actually is good for you, right? For example, right? You know, there are some folks who argue that, well, fried chicken is a tradition from the British Isles, particularly from Scotland. No, it's not. You might have been around some Scotch-Irish people who had different ways of cooking. And if you were an enslaved African, you might have taken some of those and adapted those over time so that you can make fried chicken. But the truth of the matter is, these folks weren't making fried chicken. They certainly weren't seasoning it with paprika and onions and garlic and other spices. Come on. Um, we 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 as a people, when I say we, I mean the American public, and particularly when we're talking about black folk, white folk, any folk, have a tendency to think that, oh, we just share this stuff. No, folks figure this out. Human beings are smart, they're adaptive, even those who are enslaved. And so they can look at someone's cooking and go, I'll take some parts of this to make it work for me, and other parts of this that don't work for me, and take the stuff that I already do know and mix it all together, right? In some way that makes food palatable for me, that makes food enjoyable for me, right? Even the adaptation of language, right? That's a syncretism between the language, obviously, of what would become known as American English, right, over time, colonial American English, combined with, you know, the patois, the dialects, the actual languages of Igbo and Yoruba and Asante and Infante and all these other groups who came over in chains, but of course adapted the language to work for them, right? There's still shards of Africanisms in the way African Americans speak to this day. So this idea that no, we just adopted the masses language, and we just adopted the masses religion, and African Americans just learned how to cook. We had to be taught everything by the massa kind of thing. It was complete and utter BS. It's bullcrap. Um, I won't use the language I'm really thinking of, but you get my point. So this week, really the next few weeks, but this week in particular, is about understanding how culture, first of all, that shards and large pieces of African-esque cultures survived the Middle Passage, survived slavery to make it down to folks who live in the United States today who claim to be of African descent. Not to mention folks who are not of African descent but find themselves speaking in the ways and dancing in the ways, songing in the ways, lyricking in the ways these folks were doing 350 years ago. Okay, so that's kind of my point. That is the main point of the lectures for this week, to understand that, but also to understand that when you talk about the origins and the beginnings of what we now call African American culture, that this is a culture of resistance too. That the culture itself is a form of is culture, but it's a culture in opposition to what they're being told otherwise, that they don't have a culture, that the culture is primitive, that they should just get rid of it, all those things, because that's what they're being told while they're going through slavery. So this culture is evolving while at the same time being told that you don't have a culture, right? That without this is the common refrain, by the way, of and used to be the common refrain of many American historians, particularly white American historians, up until about the 1970s. But it's also a refrain that you could hear from teachers, including my teachers growing up. You can hear from some teachers now. You can hear, heck, my mom has made these kinds of comments before, that if it weren't for the uprooting of these people from Africa, that they would be back home wearing nothing but grass skirts and with bones in their noses and dancing to primitive music and practicing voodoo and cursing each other kinds of stuff, right? All this highly toxic racist crap, right? It's not true. Not only is it not true, it completely basically denigrates these people to not being human at all. That they're not human. They're subhuman. They're monkeys. They're who eat bananas, which aren't even originally from Africa, by the way, as I've already pointed out in the first week of class, right? So that kind of BS. And so African American culture, what becomes African American culture, is really in opposition to all of that toxicity, to all of that negativity, to all of that dominance of folks saying that basically you are nothing, you are not a human being, you are less than. And so everything, the adaptation of Christianity to use for your own purposes, to sing songs that eventually be songs that you could use for code for escaping, right? Jumping the broom, having two names, a name that your master recognizes and a name that you have for yourself, right? That kind of thing. You know, having the ring shout ceremony as part of your worship every Sunday, right? And adapting to that so that you, instead of worshiping on Fridays, if you had been Muslim before, you're worshiping on Sundays, but sort of as a Muslim too, right? But even though you're technically practicing Christianity, you know, the food that you eat and the kinds of herbs and spices you use to cook it, all of it is in opposition to an entire thing, an entire institution built on the idea that you are not human, that you're just a piece of property. So everything, every aspect of African American culture stands in opposition to all this constant stream of dehumanizing racism, right? Kind of racism that people internalize, the kind of racism that people basically say, well, I'm nothing, therefore I'm going to act like I'm nothing, kind of stuff. And so African American culture really is in opposition to this, which means it's a form of resistance. The culture itself is a form of resistance to essentially what we would now call white supremacist thought and white supremacist ideas and white supremacist activities to make sure that you do not see yourself, if you are a person of color, if you're a person of color, if you are African American, if you are black, as being anything other than a human being of equally deserving of humanity, equally deserving, equally capable of a full range of emotions, a full range of creativity, a full range of activity, and a full range of reactivity to the situation that you find yourself in if you are enslaved in the United States, or what becomes the United States in the 17th and 18th centuries. So that's the week. That's the week in a nutshell. The lecture notes go over this in more detail. In class, I will go over this in more detail, but that's the gist of everything. So I want to take a few minutes to talk about this week, particularly for one class where I don't think they've taken the readings as seriously as they should. The whole purpose of last week really isn't about me, right? I only use my articles because they happen to be relevant to the course. And they happen to be relevant because there aren't too many historians who write for wider audiences. There are a few. There's Jelani Cobb who writes. There's Martha Jones, who's at Johns Hopkins, who sometimes writes on these kinds of issues for the New York Times here and there. There's Keisha Blaine, who's certainly written for other outlets. I can name a few other folks who people may or may not know who do this kind of writing, but I picked my own writing for two reasons. One, because it's the most relevant, so it's on point with what I'm doing in the course. And two, and I don't have that many of my writings really in here. There are professors who use their books. There are professors who use their textbooks in courses regularly, right? So, but so I don't think this has nothing to do with ego. Trust me. I've also taught courses where I've never used my writing. So, that's most of the courses I've taught. But the reason I'm using this writing for this particular set of exercises is because, number one, if you're able to challenge what I'm saying in the writings, it should be easier to basically anonymously write to a peer, hey, there's things that I think you need to improve in order to write a better do a better job in your writing assignment. So that's really the purpose of what last week was about, right? For some of you, maybe there weren't enough links, but there's something that's beyond my control. Al Jazeera in particular has, and a lot of other outlets, stripped out all the links you put in. So I know there were at least 15 links in my piece that you read last week. And so, that there were only 2 or 3 is not really my fault. That's beyond my control. I can't tell Al Jazeera to put 15 links back in when they're trying to make sure that everyone stays on the page to read the article, right? That's how they make money. At least part of how they make money. That's how a lot of news outlets make money. So that's not to blame. I'm not to blame for that either. But take it as you will. The main point of it is to help you, right? It's not about me. It's to help you be better at peer reviewing and assessment, to be critical, constructively critical, mind you, but critical. You want to be able to say, here are things that you need to improve, that your thesis needs more work, that sort of thing. And so that's what we're going to be doing this week. Introductions and thesis statements in classes. Ideally, you come to class prepped with a draft of you've at least written your introduction of a thesis statement by Thursday, so that you can talk about it with your peers in class. If you come to class and you haven't done all of that by Thursday, I'll certainly try to set aside time so that people can write one, right? But the truth of the matter is, it will work better if people come prepped, right? And if no one's prepped at all, or most folks aren't prepped at all, I might just end class early and say, the heck with it, you figure it out, right? So please come prepped for that purpose. Please also come prepped to, if you have any questions about the Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead, and or optionally, if you have questions for that matter about Dunbar's book, Never Caught, come prep for questions. I want to be able to answer those questions too. So really for this week, I want you prepared to take this thing, your writing assignment, to the next level, because it is due. You have a first draft due for peer review and assessment by the end of the week, the end of this week, end of week 5, 11:59 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, on Sunday, October the 9th. Your peers will then, each of you will then, as peers, review each other's work the following week and give feedback and a general assessment in terms of a grade, B plus, A minus, etc. by Sunday, October the 16th. And then you'll take those revisions, take those suggestions for revision and work on those to do your final draft, and it's due on the 23rd of October. That's where we are. That's what we're doing. Hopefully, folks will have questions throughout the week. I certainly have office hours that people are not taking advantage of, so please do that. If you really have questions that you don't want to discuss in class, contact me or come to my office hours. I mean, my door might not be open, but I will open it if you knock on it between 12:30 and 1:30 on Thursdays. All right, that's it. Take care.